I currently live in Palm Springs, and I am the vice president of what you see there, the Coachella Valley Cannabis Alliance Network, trade organization, about 160 members, all in the Coachella Valley, which is Palm Springs all the way, to Coachella, and lots of plant-touching businesses, lots of growing. Swami, it's all indoor, I'm sorry to say. But I've been doing consulting for 3 years in the cannabis space, legal compliance work. I came from the city of San Francisco. I was the head of the Entertainment Commission here in the city for 15 years. I know a lot about regulating from the government side, so I hustle for clients trying to get government to do what they're supposed to do. I've got a great panel here this morning. I can read these really long introductions, or since I really want to talk about what we're supposed to talk about, I'm going to ask you guys to introduce yourselves briefly.
Sure. My name is Zachary Eisenberg. I'm VP and COO of Anresco Laboratories. We're an analytical laboratory founded in the food space 76 years ago, but operating in the cannabis space for the past 4 years.
My name is Garrett Graff. I am the managing attorney of Hoban Law Group. We're a law firm that services both the marijuana and the hemp sides of the industry. We're based out of Denver, Colorado, but have offices around the country. So we do everything from contract work, corporate capital raising, to all the regulatory issues we're going to talk about today, to litigation and beyond.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mike Kohner. I'm the president and founder of ezGreen Compliance. We're a HIPAA point of sale for the cannabis space. We integrate with Metric in 12 states, and so my expertise is really protecting patient data and workflows and taxation. However, I do have a client that has a really dynamic cannabis and hemp product, so I do have some interesting things to talk about today.
I'm Swami Chaitanya and co-founder of Swami Select brand cannabis flowers. We're up in Mendocino County in the heart of the Emerald Triangle, and I've been a grower since 1987. So, oh no, Nikki says 78. I always get those numbers back. All right. Anyway, let's get started.
A long time. Okay, awesome. He's one of the OGs, I like to say, right? So this is a really big topic in your programs, right? We're supposed to talk about hemp, cannabis, and the black market. A discussion of quality and safety. That's a really big topic. And I think that, for better or worse, it's really timely. Who here has read about the Vapegate? Everybody? Anybody? Yeah. It's interesting. I think it's conflating issues around tobacco and cannabis, but be that as it may, it's brought to light, I think, a lot of things that we've been complaining in the cannabis space about. Do any of you have statistics in the front of your mind relative to where we are? And what I want to do initially is say it's a horrible thing that anyone has died. It's really sad, and we're all, obviously, like, public safety is a huge thing. We're not going to minimize this by virtue of talking about, the pros and cons or what's true and what's not true. So I just want to say that it's really bad, and I'm sure everyone in this room is sad that anyone is being hurt in any way by a product that's coming out of, whether it's tobacco or, cannabis, legal, illegal. People shouldn't die. But that being said, does anyone have sort of information, just based statistics? Where are we at in terms of deaths and sicknesses?
Well, in terms of the statistics, I think we're still figuring out all the information, right? This is still relatively new. That in the past several weeks, couple months, I think there's a citation of 18 deaths. Okay. To put that in perspective, though, think about the opioid crisis, 22. Right? 22. There you go. But so the point is that this is still unraveling and unfolding as we speak, and there's lots of things that we don't know, and that underscores today's conversation about public safety. And that's not just a hemp thing. That's not just a marijuana thing. That's any sort of agricultural commodity, any sort of finished good, any sort of plant botanical. How do we ensure from an FDA, from a state level, that what you're putting into your body, you're putting on your body, is appropriate to do so?
Right. Does anyone know specifically, like, what's making people sick?
I can speak to that. The answer is nobody really knows for sure what's making people sick, which is a little bit scary. They suspected it was vitamin E acetate, which is a diluent that's used primarily in the black market because there's not the same economic incentives to dilute products in the legal market. So that's pretty much where everyone is getting sick and where the deaths are occurring from, but people are conflating the legal market with the black market, with the nicotine market. Do you want to?
Whistleblower, excuse me. I'm going to be disruptive for a minute. I'm Granddaddy Mike. I just want to object to the term black market.
I agree. We're going to try to use illegal.
Yeah,
We're going to try
let's
to.
talk about it as a traditional market, right?
Got
Traditional
it.
supply chain. I think black means we're buying into the prohibitionist propaganda
Okay.
of good and evil.
I got you.
Right? And so I completely object to it. I'm not evil. The people that are in this industry are not evil. So let's call it, please, the traditional market.
We'll do what we can. Thank you. Oops. Okay. So we're still figuring out what it is, but what I think I've heard, and I think I'm gonna go with this for the conversation, is that primarily the people who are sick and who have died, unfortunately, were underage, under 21, and or have obtained this from the illegal, traditional underground market, the non-licensed marketplace.
The unregulated
How's that?
marketplace. How about
Unregulated. So given that, if all those unsafe products were obtained that way, is it obvious that products in the legal market are safe? And if not, how can consumers know the difference?
I think that's a loaded question. There's a ton of different things that go into
It's
that.
loaded
issue.
on purpose.
Well, understandably so, right? But again, you're trying to think through, when you vape a product, just in general, forget what's in it, right? Whether it be cannabis, hemp, marijuana, tobacco, there's a combustion that happens there, right? And so if you don't understand all the different ingredients that are in that product and what can occur.
Sorry, I know I asked the question,
Sure. No,
but
absolutely.
they actually want to know the answer.
So we're still discovering, what those ingredients will do when combusted as part of, a vape product. And again, that transcends any specific botanical that you're dealing with, whether that be tobacco, marijuana, hemp, or otherwise. But we're still evaluating that. This is just so brand new, relatively speaking. Certainly, I think that there's more understandable concern with respect to the unregulated marketplace, given that there's not very much data with respect to what those products contain or don't contain. That's not suggesting that those folks are manufacturing poorly. There's just simply not data. So the lack of information becomes problematic. Whereas in the regulated marketplace, there is more information available. But even, for example, right now in Maryland, they're evaluating all of the flavors that are going in, and rumor has it that they're going to heavily regulate a lot of those flavors because of concerns with respect to vape products and how they're consumed.
It seems to me that we're really in a strange situation here, because we have a substance called tobacco, which kills hundreds of thousands of people every year, and nobody's really quite talking about that in relation to this. Likewise, when you have a vape pen, what's in there? You don't really know what the propelling agent, what the combusting agent is, especially if there's no testing. But it seems to me what we really have to do is go back at the source of this. And why is there still an illicit or a traditional market? The reason is that the regulation has been so extreme and so misguided. And the fact is that there are hundreds of cities in the state of California which forbid all cannabis. There are 38 counties out of 58 in California that forbid cannabis in their county. So this is, I think, we also have to throw this onto the authorities to say, if you legalized it and if you authorized in your place, you would have control over it to a certain extent, and you would tend to reduce the black market. So I think we have to throw this back on the government. The reason it was made illegal in the first place was total misguided by this guy, Harry Anslinger. And, the reason this happened, this is on government. Government is lying to us. They've been lying to us forever. They've been lying to us now still about how THC is the bad guy and CBD is the good guy. Whole plant medicine is the answer. You can't let the government off on this. And the fact is that the people who are in the traditional market, they need to make a living, and we've been making a living. And when we were just selling flour, there wasn't much of this problem at all. The other thing with tobacco, there's no testing for tobacco. Do you understand that? There's not a single test for pesticides for tobacco. Google it. You'll be outraged if you Google tobacco and pesticides. And we burn tobacco. We don't burn anything else except cannabis, so they've never tested any of this. So the pesticide use in tobacco is immoral and unethical, and yet they totally get away with it. So I think we have to really look at getting everything, all cities and all counties to legalize it, and then enforcing testing. And every state in the country has to enforce testing, because as much as I, as a grower, don't want to pay for it $1,000 a batch, it's a guarantee to the consumer. And my ethical responsibility of giving people medicine is to give them something pure. And that's the most important thing.
Thank you.
They need something pure.
Thank you. So with respect to this idea that consumers, like, I'm a regular consumer, right? I know a little more than some people do. How do I know? And I know we talked about this a little bit earlier. How would I know if I went into a licensed store? If I can't, one, I can't hardly see the tiny little things that are printed on these tiny little packages. But two, how do I know about quality assurance and what is, happening?
I think it's a brand. It's going to be a brand, just like the rest of the thing. You trust a brand in this country.
There's a guy here from a lab. How about?
Well, part of the problem is that there are more illegal dispensaries in the city of Los Angeles than there are legal dispensaries in the entire state of California, and they're all listed on weed maps. So it's hard for consumers to know what's legitimate and what's not, and that's going to be a problem until they take those dispensaries down. And they copy the packaging of the legitimate suppliers, so to them, even if they trust the brand, like, they're not going to know for sure whether it's safe or not. So until there's more enforcement on cracking down on these people that are distributing illicit products, then you're going to have the situation where there's going to be commingling of the two in the marketplace.
So that's a great point. And so I live on the East Coast, but I'm in cannabis, so I travel all around the world. And I can tell you with accuracy that there are growers in California sending packaging and generic products to the East Coast because they're looking for specific brands that people think are hot and popular, but they're not tested. There's no proof to that. It's like a fake handbag. So the way in which the grower, which is putting as the caregiver into the product, can reach the consumer is through technology. And you can look for certain products that have a QR code that you can scan with your smartphone, and it will show you the lab results, which is a certificate of authenticity for 2 tests. The first test is for the potency of THC or CBD in that product. And the second, which is called a phase 3 test, which is the $1,000 test that he has to pay for, shows a panel of everything from metals to solvents to fungus that could be in that product. So that if you're, so I'm my mom's caregiver in the sense that she has cancer, and so we're going through testing different CBD, THC strains to help reduce inflammation. And because she's on the East Coast, her oncologist is like, oh, if you have pain, you should take opioids. And I said, Mom, that's not the case. So luckily, because I have friends out here and farmers, I was able to introduce her to a physician from UCLA who gave her a tremendous amount of information about reports that we're using in Israel right now about the benefits of taking CBD and THC. And when I bring her products home, I show her how to scan the QR code and look at the certificate of authenticity. And because we are segregated in the United States with different states having different regulations, we can all agree eventually that their certificate of authenticity is a great way for consumers to begin getting comfortable and acclimated to the product that they're going to put in their body or they're going to recommend for one of their loved ones is safe and doesn't contain any of these things that kids are getting sick with.
Well, and I think what we need to keep in mind is that, at the end of the day, hemp and marijuana are botanicals, and tinctures, capsules, all these different consumer goods are just that, consumer goods. We have a regulatory framework at the federal level, at the state level, at local levels that handle those sorts of things, right? Even on the marijuana side, even though it remains federally illegal, there's still this FDA framework that is guiding, at least in some respect, both hemp and marijuana. At the state level, the states like California, Colorado, and across the country, they draw upon federal regulation. Now, look outside the marijuana industry and the hemp industry. You still get E. coli and other bacteria issues. We still have vaping issues with nicotine and non-marijuana or hemp. So this is not a hemp or marijuana thing, period, right? This is any consumer good, any botanical issue, and there are frameworks already in place that we can replicate. We were talking before we came up on stage. There are established testing companies that have been around testing foods and supplements and things like that for decades. Guess what? They can test for pesticides. They can test for potencies. So these aren't foreign. These aren't concepts uniquely nuanced and to hemp or marijuana. We simply have to extrapolate and leverage a lot of these other expertises into this space and provide opportunities through QR codes.
But there isn't
on
a lot of
labels.
testing for smoke products. Like there is a pesticide that's myclobutanol called Eagle 20, which was used by a lot of growers, and they thought is okay because it's approved by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. But the fact is, it's approved for hard shell fruits like pears and apples and plums, right? So you can wash it off. But when you spray it on a cannabis flower, it gets in there. But the difference is, we smoke cannabis flowers. We don't smoke grape skins. So they've never tested the grape and the myclobutanol for what happens when it's combusted. And there are other pesticides exactly like that, which may be perfectly fine by the Department of Agriculture. But when you combust them or you put them with an oil in a vape pen, who knows what happens? And another thing is, when you concentrate something from a flower that might be sort of okay, it didn't test on a flower level, then you concentrate it, you get parts per million. All of a sudden, whatever that toxic element is multiplied many times, and then it becomes toxic, even though in the flower test it wasn't. So our testing labs really have to come up. California banned all pesticides for hemp, for cannabis, 66 of them, and now they have until, I believe, 2023 to come up with a protocol for which pesticides are going to be approved for cannabis, because they have to go through and test things for combustion, which they never did before because tobacco doesn't allow it.
Super interesting. So since we touched on hemp, let's just talk a little bit about that. I know there's somewhat of a rift. Hemp is federally legal. I wrote this question, sort of, how do hemp-derived CBD products get tested for safety? We know there's a massive difference. Do they not get tested?
They don't.
Is this the same standard across all states? And I think we're talking in a big way about standardization, and that's sort of what we can see if we look pretty far down the road, and that's what we're hoping for. Obviously, we're trying to keep up just in our states with what's going on, let alone what's going on in other states. People that are poisoning themselves by sitting in the hemp space, waiting till federal legalization, in theory, of cannabis, right? They're trying to figure out, right, how do I prepare? How do I minimize my risk? But initially, what's the testing state of affairs in hemp?
Sure. Well, there is none. So there's a huge difference between cannabis.
Write that down.
Huge difference between cannabis-derived and regulated CBD products and hemp-derived products.
The stuff that's in Walgreens that says CBD, you're telling me it's not tested?
Nothing's required. So
It doesn't even have CBD in it in many cases. They taste it off the market and it said, this is so, it doesn't have CBD.
Wow. Okay, keep going.
Yeah, so the only thing the federal government is worried about is whether it classifies as hemp or cannabis, and there's somewhat of an arbitrary distinction because they're essentially the same plant, they just have a different composition of cannabinoids. So once the product is verified as a hemp product under 0.3% THC, then there's no testing requirements mandated after that. So the finished product doesn't have to be tested for
I think
potency.
that'll change. The Department of Agriculture is going to put up regulations pretty soon.
Somebody have a
Hope so.
clue?
Yeah, so it's already in the process of changing, right? I mean, we have to look at the hemp side of the industry, and hemp was, for the first time in decades, allowed to be grown in 2014 domestically. And then, fast forward to 2018, and Congress decided to figure out a few more things that they forgot to put in the bill in 2014. So as of December of last year, you now have direct authority vested in the USDA for regulating the cultivation and directing what types of pesticides, if any, can be applied to hemp, and all the other cultivation protocols with respect to hemp. And then at the same time, FDA is evaluating how to integrate hemp-derived cannabinoids into various product types: foods, supplements, cosmetics, maybe OTC drugs. While you're right in that there's a little bit of a loosey-goosiness, so to speak, with respect to testing, I would tell you that a decent amount, if not the majority, and increasing regularly within the hemp space, are already adhering to existing FDA regulations for other similar product types: food, supplements, cosmetics. States like Indiana, Utah, Texas, and others have implemented this QR code requirement that we were discussing a moment ago, where on the label you must have a QR code that connects to a batch certificate of analysis, C of A, that is going to contain reference to pesticides, heavy metals, potency, and other information, with respect to product transparency and, helping you understand what you're putting into your body. Furthermore, best practices would also recommend manufacturing in accordance with good manufacturing practices, GMPs. This is not a foreign concept. There are GMPs for foods, for supplements, for cosmetics. They've been around for decades. All the large companies that are selling products at the grocery stores are following them. So guess what? It's fairly easy to integrate and extrapolate that to the hemp space, and that's what's in the process of going on now. So it's really a function of patience at this point, of industry doing its job to adhere to best practices and up their game, while working with the FDA to put in place sensible regulation around all of those things too.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, not to duplicate it. We're doing the same thing in the state of California, where there are meetings right now about setting organic certification for cannabis within California. And part of the debate is, do we need separate cannabis organic, different from California organic? Do we need separate cannabis organic, different from U.S. organic? No, we don't. Those things are there. And it's important to realize that. And actually, before I forget, I do want to say something about, I'm sure most of you know that it's really about whole plant medicine, and this deriving CBD from hemp, I think is a wrong way street, because we know, and there's been many experiments now happening in Israel, that if you have, like say, a higher percentage, say over 5 to 10% of THC with your CBD, your effect of your botanical is 70 times greater than if you just have CBD alone or minor THC. Do not fall prey to the lie that THC is not medicinal. THC is one of the main medicinal ingredients, and they are lying to us from the government once again. You got to make sure it's full plant medicine, otherwise it's not going to work nearly as well.
Well, the quality of hemp and how it's regulated may change over time, but the point I was trying to make earlier is that currently there are no testing requirements for hemp. So whereas any cannabis product prior to retail sale or distribution has to be tested for pesticides, residual solvents, potency, heavy metals, mycotoxins, anything that might be...
But that's only in California. There are many states that have legal cannabis that don't have any testing.
Yeah, and California probably has the strictest requirements of any
Absolutely.
state in the country, and perhaps has the strictest requirements of any legal market in the world. So the products sold in the legal cannabis framework are extremely clean, are labeled accurately. Hemp products, there are large companies and they have SOPs and they're doing proactive testing, but there's nothing mandated. So there's been purchases of CBD products online from Amazon and other stores, and a lot of them are mislabeled or have contaminants, and so there is a meaningful difference between the quality of CBD derived from the cannabis market as opposed to the hemp market.
Right. So I think that's really important, right, as sort of the general public starts to try to understand what's going on and sees articles in the New York Times and the LA Times about sort of vaping, again, conflating tobacco and youth vaping with cannabis issues, and then identifying THC as like demonic. And it always blows my mind, because I do this work, and probably most of you do as well, how many people know nothing, literally. And so reading those stories and conflating all these issues makes the confusion even further. And then what we see from governments is sort of a knee-jerk reaction in terms of banning. Do you guys have any comments, perspective of bans? Because if we're saying, hey, government, the reason we have this illegal market is because of overregulation and missteps and under-regulation, if you will, with 2/3 of California in particular not allowing commercial marketplace for cannabis, but having a hemp market that's barely regulated. Yeah, so what do you think is an appropriate government reaction, and or what's your response to sort of this banning mentality.
Well, they should just legalize all of it everywhere, and then you have a customer protection. You also get tax income and so on. As much as I kind of didn't want legalization and regulation now, I mean, it was inevitable once Colorado did it. So the whole idea is that we have to be there guiding the people because, as you said, they don't know anything about this. And now they're starting to ask questions of us. But you have things with the vape pens specifically where for a while they were finding a lot of the cartridge for the vape pens coming from China had heavy metals that were leached out because in some of these vape pens they inject terpenes afterwards, and the terpenes are acidic and they leach out heavy metals out of the interior of the cartridge itself. And so, like we say, they still haven't figured out what's causing this problem.
But so to that point, though, right? You have a couple different interests at play. At the very beginning of today, you said, "Hey, it's terrible that anyone's dying." But then, if we take this idea of just legalize it, that while that may be the right call for purposes of the botanical itself, that doesn't necessarily or inherently address the public safety concerns and consumer concerns.
Well, legalization has to have testing.
Well, agreed, but so how do you implement those standards, though, right? That's what the FDA and other agencies are wrestling with.
Well, there are no standards. That's our lab guy
Well, I
was
know,
saying.
but so that's the inherent point is if you legalize it, that just doesn't mean that standards all of a sudden miraculously appear. There's a process that has to be engaged in to establish all of that.
And we got to
When you-
start that process.
Yeah, well, when you look at vape products, forget hemp and marijuana for a moment. Vapes first hit the marketplace 20 plus years ago, right? Something like that? Do you know when vape products were finally regulated by the FDA? 3 years ago, 2016. So the FDA took 15 plus years to figure out what regulations to put in place for vape products. And then 3 years later, they said, we probably got it wrong because people are starting to die out there, right? And so it's engaging in that process. And so while I'm certainly not advocating for a banning mentality, a temporary ban or something like that as the FDA and other state agencies go through this process to help protect against people dying, there may not be another way to address that, at least in the minds of some state regulators. So I'm not advocating for that, but that's where we have to find a sensible balance there as we figure out what the appropriate ingredients, flavoring, testing, all of that for these types of products are.
Do you think it'll take another 15 years?
I certainly hope not.
Because that's a long ban.
I agree, but that's where I think if the industry and consumers and the regulators can all come together to help pin down what the issue is, as you were noting earlier, we thought 2 months ago was vitamin E acetate or A acetate, right? And so at this point, we're still trying to figure out what exactly the problem is. So how can we, implement meaningful change if we still have yet to identify all of the true underlying problems?
I respectfully disagree. I don't think a temporary ban or a permanent ban would be helpful for the reason that all these illnesses are deriving from the illicit market. And if you ban it in the legal market, they're still going to exist there. You're going to push people into that market. There's going to be even more consumption of the dangerous products because we've tested probably 150, 200 plus samples in the legal market. All of them have passable levels of vitamin E acetate. We've tested samples in the black market, and over 2/3 of them have failing levels of traditional market, have failing levels of vitamin E acetate. These are extracts. But in addition to that, they have extremely high levels of pesticides and heavy metals and solvents like benzene, which are incredibly dangerous to consume in a combustible manner. So I don't think that, I think that the legal market extracts are safe to consume. And not to say that everything in the traditional market is unsafe, but I'm saying that the extracts that we've tested there's a clear distinction in quality and safety between the two.
So can we launch into a conversation about how to handle the unlicensed, illegal, traditional market? Because I think it's it's kind of like chewing on an elephant, but let's try.
I just want to say, I think there are 3 markets out there, which is the licensed market, the traditional market where you come from and Swami comes from, and then there is this illegal market where, like as an example, a kid comes over from another country, sets up a shop in Miami, he gets a bunch of crude oil sent over to him, he gets a little vape machine, he manufactures, he gets fake branding, he puts it out there. He's like 25 years old, he was taught to do that in another country, he's selling it to that market. That is not traditional. That is black market, that is dangerous. And so I don't think we should compare that market to the traditional market, which is why we're here. But
there are greedy people
Correct.
who are ignorant,
Correct.
right, who are contaminating our marketplace.
Okay, but I do think that's a completely legitimate and interesting way, actually, to continue this conversation, given there are legacy businesses, legacy farmers, folks who worked really hard to get a bunch of us where we are today, and they need respect. And I think that's a really interesting way to discuss that, given, right, this dangerous sort of illegal space that you just described. What now?
I want to just say I support highest and best practices across the industry, right? And that includes quality control for the products that are being presented out there.
Of course.
But I need to also say, this is very reminiscent to me, and I've lived through it, of another cycle of paranoia, Chicken Little driven bans and prohibitions that are wide sweeping, irrational, and frankly inappropriate. So we need to identify the bad players, right? And as an industry, we need to take pride in doing that.
I have a new panelist from the audience.
I'm sorry.
It's okay.
I don't mean to object.
That's okay. Let's get back up here.
And I mean, from that perspective, we need to create universal standards right across the board. That absolutely, makes a lot of sense. And from a banning perspective, we were talking earlier, right? 22 deaths on, in this versus the opioid crisis. Yet those aren't banned. So I'm not personally advocating for the banning mentality, but that's where state regulators are looking at it, right?
Yeah.
Because they're not sure what to do. But how do we, as quickly and efficiently as possible, put standards in place, identify the issues to address the problems that are out there?
So we're saying, in what I'm hearing, maybe is don't ban but standardize. Like that's the hashtag, because then
See, the other thing is that
standardization means.
But they're picking on cannabis again.
Sure.
Right? And
Well-
then just using this as another excuse to pick on cannabis and another excuse to divide the community. Right? That's what Mike is talking about. We've had a community up in the mountains, and we've been hiding out for 50 years, right? Now we're out in public, and now people are starting to register to vote. People getting driver's license. God knows they're even getting bank accounts. We had to hide for 50 years, right? But now, half of my friends up there are still in the traditional market. They're legacy growers. And most of them are really doing it as well as they can do it, right? But now they're picking on cannabis again to go after it, and that whole thing reigniting the reefer madness with Alex Berenson, that guy, anyway, forget about him. But the fact is we have to get down and realize that this is still dividing the community. They're still attacking cannabis. They're forgetting about opioids. They're forgetting about alcohol. They're forgetting about tobacco that kills hundreds of thousands of people.
I know we're all gonna work through this, and you were gonna finish the thought.
Just one
where
point
you're
I want to
heading.
make from a branding and marketing perspective. If you look at the folks out there that are putting on the bans at the state level, they're using their names. They're not saying the state of Massachusetts, saying Charlie Baker came out, I'm here, and I'm implementing this. So it's very clear that the folks that are taking a stand and doing the vape bans are politically motivated, because they're using their own names, not just saying, hey, it's my region. They're saying their names, so that's something to think about. Then you need to peel back the onion and say, well, who's benefiting from this, and who are they influenced by, and who are their political sponsors? Because that seems to be motivated, because this would be a little more generic if this was a real problem.
Okay, do we kill that? Let's do one more question for you guys, and then I want to see if anyone wants to use that microphone.
I want to say something about the testing in general, and maybe you can help me with this too, is that we said something, there are no standards for testing, even within California and across the United States. So do you use a gas chromatography or do you use liquid chromatography? How do you make the testing? And from one lab to the next, most of the labs actually have patented or whatever registered copyrighted protocols for how they go about testing whatever it is. And in a sense, there's no zero. If you're in a testing lab for a blood test that's certified by the government, they will send out from the government testing standards, and you put that in your machine, and if your machine doesn't come up with the same standard that's come out from the government, you have to calibrate your machine, and there's a very high-level scientist who's tasked with doing that. Now, California has all these laws now for all the testing in the testing labs. They have to have a PhD and so on, but there's still no standardization of how the test is supposed to be conducted, and from state state to state that doesn't even have any tests. This is a real problem, and I guess it's going to have to be on the federal level that they're going to come up with standards.
And I think that that's what we're hearing, right? We can see in the long view or shorter, hopefully.
And another thing, when we would bring in
standardization.
stuff for the lab, you'd bring in a 2-pound bag, and they'd go and they'd pull a bud out of here, and they'd pull a bud out of here, and they'd pull a bud out of here. And how is that standard for your product, right?
So we
So the
need-
testing itself has a lot of ways to go, I think, to really get rigorous.
And we need that, and we might be able to get farther along on the hemp side, given that it's currently federally legal, and then apply it as we move towards deschedule. All right, well, we just did that. So how about we take some questions? We already talked to you, sir. How about you? Can everybody hear? You might have to use that microphone back there. Sorry. Maybe you can take it out.
Good morning. So the question I have is, what sort of price discount is going on in the black market today?
No black. No,
Generally?
we don't do black.
Traditional. And is that price difference quite different whether in California or other parts of the country?
Well, of course, it's different in California. What I've been hearing is the traditional market, legacy market, is about $1,500 a pound wholesale, between $1,000 and $1,500 a pound. About 3 years ago, because Oregon flooded the market, it was down to $500 a pound. So there's an indication that the traditional market is back up and reviving. And I know some growers who did stop a couple years ago. They're back in it because, well, you can make a little money. And what's the difference? You go to a regular dispensary, right, and now you're paying all the taxes that they even tax me for growing medical cannabis. Can you believe that? They tax me for growing medical cannabis. And so you pay that tax, the tax that I have to pay, that gets passed on to the consumer, then the 15% tax for cannabis, and then the 8% regular sales tax, and then whatever else the dispensary has to put on to make their profit, because they're struggling also, right? And so by the time at the end of the day, the out-the-door price for a product from a dispensary is 60 to 70% higher than the traditional market price. And so the smart consumer's going around the corner to Joe over there where he knows he can get it, right? It ain't tested.
It does change around the country. To the point made just a moment ago by Swami about $1,000, $1,500 a pound. In Colorado, the regulated marketplace wholesale price per pound is under $1,000, $700 to $900 as of right now.
But in the traditional in New York, it's probably still around $4,000 for a pound if you can get it
that
there.
shows the vacillation, but also in Colorado, the regulated marketplace has displaced a lot of the unregulated marketplace, and a lot of that comes with the pricing component. As Swami noted, if there's a substantial price difference, of course there's going to be an economic incentive.
So on the vape, I don't even want to say traditional market. I want to say the vape black market, where people aren't going to real farmers. They're grabbing products they're manufacturing in the street. If you're getting product from California, they're wholesaling for between $8 and $10 interstate over to the East Coast, and then they're selling it anywhere from $18 to $30, depending on the brand, which is where the real trick comes in, because they're just printing brand labels that aren't accurate and slapping them on there because kids want cookies or they want Supreme or there's something out there that's popular that they're using and deciding through social media.
Wow. That's scary.
So I have a comment about the standardization discussion. So I came out of the financial industry way back in 85, 84, before we had Visa and MasterCard running these organizations. But what we did is we didn't wait for the government to put together standards. We actually created industry standards under the ISO, which is the International Standards Organization. So if you look at the body of work and standardization around credit cards, people like myself and people in the industry wrote all of those standards. So when you talk about e-regulations about what you can access a bank account versus a credit card account, we wrote those standards, and we live in this industry. And it was my first comment. I mean, I'm very new in this market, but my first comment was to our team is, where is the standardization organization for this industry? Because you don't want to wait on government to write your standards, or you will never get anywhere, and you will end up with stuff you do not want to see. So it's incumbent on us as participants in this industry to gather around, create those standards. As a manufacturer, we have a vape product. I'm a manufacturer. I'm very, very much interested in developing those standards. You talk about cartridges. I mean, I've been doing manufacturing in China for 20 years. So we know they use lead because it's very moldable. And that's why we pass standards called Ross and Weed to get all of those poisonous types of materials out of our products. So you don't have lead in our products. Why are they showing up in cartridges?
I think there is an organization working on standardization in cannabis.
Well, I think we're conflating some different things. I think there's regulations, including requirements for testing, and that's actually already very rigorous in the state of California. So I think, from a safety standpoint, products sold on the legal, regulated market are already pretty safe. What we're talking about is market products that are not in that market, and so those are unregulated, and it's hard, even if the AOAC or ASTM or some other standards organization came out with, you should be testing for these compounds and potentially hazardous analytes, and these should be the limits for each. You're not going to get those bad actors, not traditional people, but people that are making intentionally mislabeled and carcinogenic products. You're not going to get them to.
I feel like we have to, those
adhere to
tracks
standards.
have to go down together, right? The train has to move together because these things have to happen at the same time to work on repressing the illegal marketplace and work towards standards. I mean, they have to do both.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different issues at play there. So ASTM has a cannabis committee. They're evaluating
What
standards.
does that stand for?
ASTM, that's one of the standards making organizations. ISO, so for example, like I said before, there's testing facilities that are ISO certified based upon decades old ISOs and other certification standards that can be extrapolated and applied, right? In terms of pesticide testing and heavy metals testing and potency testing. Those are things that are already governed by existing standards. Maybe tweaks are needed as necessary, but those can be evaluated. In
What
large
about
part,
manufacturing standards, what she's talking about?
so from an FDA level, and which is mirrored at the state and local levels, good manufacturing practices exist. Now, in terms of what ingredients can be used and how they're combusted, when we talk specifically about vape products, yeah, some of those are some novel issues that need to be addressed. But to suggest that there's zero framework, whether it's required or proactive or however we want to characterize it, there are plenty of standards out there.
I'm not suggesting that there are no standards. What I am suggesting is that there needs to be a venue for traditional people to participate in those standards. To me, it's very top down, and I understand that there are costs associated with running those tests and stuff. But to have a broader participation in the creation of those standards is what I'm saying I have not seen. I mean, I know you disagree and you're shaking your head.
No. I agree with you. But what I'm saying is, you can go join the ASTM Cannabis Committee and participate. And so there are opportunities out there. I'm not saying I agree with you wholeheartedly. And so what I'm encouraging everyone is to go out and identify that there are, in fact, opportunities right now. There are plenty of standards. Do they need to be improved and extrapolated and tweaked? Absolutely. But there are opportunities out there, and I would encourage involvement.
Okay, we have 1 minute left. Is there any really fast question? Sorry.
Hi. So whether we're talking about low THC cannabis or high THC hemp, shouldn't the first standard be rooted in the botany rather than 0.3% THC, but instead whether it is designed and fit for human consumption or not?
Lawyers?
Well, let me just take, I'm not an attorney, but there are two certificate of authenticity tests that can be done. One is for the potency of the product, and the other is a full panel of all the dangerous things that we need to make sure aren't in there for us to consume. And so when he talks, there's a $100 test that he can test something on to see the potency, but then there's a $1,000 test that he spends to make sure that it's safe. There's no fungus, there's no metals, and so that information being shared with the consumer is one part. The other thing I wanted to speak about, the last question, is I just heard about this recently, there's a super COA coming out, which means it will give you the ingredients of the product, and it will give you the ingredients and source of the packaging. Because if in some instances we're getting these metallics, bless you, coming into the product through the vape pens that are manufactured in other countries with no standards, that could be part of the problem of how these 22 deaths that we've just seen reported recently. So as the education comes out and the transfer of knowledge to consumers through technology, that's how we'll be able to make better decisions.
Okay.
Let me
Last
rephrase then.
Whoa.
Because I think that the point that I was making was, in fact, that the 0.3 standard that is put forth in the federal definitions fails to protect the consumer and fails to be operational at any local jurisdiction.
it's arbitrary.
It
I
is, and that's
entirely-
why I was like looking for a lawyer. Because
Yeah, it's arbitrary, and your point's well taken, and right. And so we can sit here and discuss from an advocacy or an activism mentality of what's right or what we believe to be the appropriate standard. But at the end of the day, at least as of right now, we have to abide by what's the law. So it's written in the law, and
We never did that before.
your point's well taken.
Making the assumption that they tell us how we do what we do, when in fact we spent the last 40 years adapting society to come around to where we've been since
Oh my
the
God,
very
I
beginning.
love the people in this room
Yeah.
so much. Okay, we are out of time. I'm sure they're going to stick around.
Thank you very much,
so
everybody.
We appreciate it.